Hello and welcome to our talk. I am Shahid Latif, a PhD candidate at University of Duisburg-Essen, Germany. Today I'm going to present the findings of our qualitative analysis on a set of professional data stories with an objective to derive guidelines or best practices that can be helpful in an effective story design. This work is done in collaboration with Siming Chen and Fabian Beck. Text and visualizations are two integral parts of a data story. Both play different roles in a story. While visualizations show the underlying data and allow for exploration in many cases, textual elements provide explanations and incorporate context behind the data. Stories can have different forms. Some are visually dominant and include few textual elements. These elements can appear at various places in the story. Others may include longer textual explanations which may serve various purposes in the story. These explanations can provide backdrop of the story, explain how the data was collected or prepared, or explain analysis insights. As intrigued visualization researchers, we were interested to know what makes these stories effective and what factors should be considered to design such stories. Taking into the existing literature provided us with some answers. Different design strategies, structuring, and sequencing, as well as the factors that influence the reading experience, are all important. The design space analysis of professionally written stories is a great way of revealing important design considerations as demonstrated by these papers. However, the role of textual narrative is somewhat underexplored. We believe that investigating the purpose of every sentence and visualization within a story and how they reference each other can further shed light on achieving a more coherent representation in these stories. We refer to our analysis as the fine-grained interplay of text and visualization. For investigating this fine-grained interplay, we came up with two main research questions. The first question relates to individual ingredients of a story, that are text and visualization. The goal is to look at the narrative to find out what the prominent insights are, how context is blended with them, and how these insights are communicated, both textually and visually. The second question, on the other hand, focuses on the interplay. In particular, we look for what type of links exist between the two media and how they are co-referenced. Also, we were interested to know how and in what sequence are the visualizations embedded into the narrative. As for the analysis, we restricted ourselves to stories that talk about geographic data analysis and include at least one or more geographic visualizations. The main reason for this was the spatiotemporal nature of data, that what we believe makes the data reporting more challenging. Besides, it usually requires versatile visualizations to show different aspects of such data. For instance, some visualization with a geographic focus and others with a temporal one. We analyzed 22 stories, which were collected from 10 well-known journalistic sources, with majority of stories coming from three sources: New York Times, 538, and BBC. 12 of the stories were collected on a variety of themes such as culture, economics, politics, science, and health to maximize the diversity of topics. The remaining 10 stories were on a single topic of COVID-19. These stories have the same context, yet they cover various aspects of the pandemic. We divided every story into individual sentences and visualizations. This resulted in almost 1,200 sentences and 118 visualizations for all stories in our sample collection. The open coding of all the sentences and visualizations resulted in 45 distinct descriptive codes. These codes are organized into 4 categories and 12 subcategories. The textual narrative is roughly split into 2 parts. First, the data-driven part that communicates the analysis findings. This part of the text implicitly references various parts of the visualizations. Second part of the text serves as an embedding and either provides structure to the story or adds various types of context. The visualization text linking category refers to either the text elements that appear inside a visualization or those sentences in the textual narrative that explicitly refer to the visualizations. Here is an overview of all the descriptive codes along with their frequencies of occurrences. The structure of sentences is usually complex and sometimes not possible to split them into disjoint and non-overlapping codes. Therefore, we allowed multiple assignments to a single sentence. Same was the case with visualizations. Let's look at different code categories a bit more closely and try to answer the first research question. While it was no surprise that location and time were described very frequently as we focused on geographic narratives, we see that insights closely relate to high-level analysis tasks. They can be grouped into identify, summarize, or compare tasks. For instance, identifying data points that are unique and then describing them individually or as a cluster. Here you see an example of an outlier with respect to both geographic and temporal variables. It describes that California had the highest number of public mass shootings to date. Here is another data-driven sentence that describes statistical relationship between three variables. In the perspective of French presidential elections, it describes that areas with high median income were more likely to vote for the centrist candidate. But the effect was not the same when education was taken into account. Sufficient background or domain-specific terminology that is needed to understand the story is included. Here is an example sentence that conveys domain knowledge about inaudible noise in a very simple language. We also observe specific descriptions about the dataset that can make the analysis more transparent. For example, explaining as to why some parts of data were filtered out. Similarly, authors of the story interpret the insights, deduce other insights, connect insights with quotations from researchers or policymakers, and even add their personal judgments. As for the visual communication of insights, we observed the use of 8 different types of visualizations in our sample collection. To classify all visualizations into distinct types, we used the visualization taxonomy as used in the work of Porkin and others. We also tried to determine the purpose of every visualization in the story. We observed that visualizations mostly serve three main purposes. They can provide an overview, facilitate comparison, or highlight details with respect to a certain aspect. These purposes are overlapping, and a single visualization can serve multiple purposes. Map visualizations were most frequent, and they were a standard and common way of providing an overview of the geographic data. Among maps, the choropleth maps were more common. Going beyond just the geographical variable, animating a map was a way of providing geotemporal overview. However, maps were mostly limited to a single statistical variable. Extending maps beyond a single variable and to allow comparisons across two or more variables, multiple versions of a similar map can be placed side by side. Small multiples are yet another way of providing temporal comparisons of a variable across many different regions. For example, every country or city can have its own line or area plot on a similar scale. The use of tabular visualizations was also frequent. Unlike choropleth maps, tables are very flexible and can even include uncertainty or distribution of the variable to allow even better comparisons. All tables in our sample collection used some type of visual encoding or sparklines embedded in them. While most of the visualizations were quite standard and well known in our sample, we also observed the use of some less well known visualizations. For instance, the use of colored overlapping semicircles in a timeline to provide an overview of two variables or a bee-swarm distribution plot. Now that we know about the ingredients of the stories, let's look at the structure and how they interplay. Here we see the structure of all stories in our collection. Every story is represented with a series of colored rectangles. The color represents the code category. The width of each rectangle corresponds to the length of the sentence in words. To get a comparable scale across text and visualizations, we approximated visualization as to the number of words that would fit in the same screen space. We found that highly explorable stories tend to be shorter. For instance, A1, A6, A12, B2. One of them even includes multiple visualizations linked via brushing and linking. We see that stories are structured in different sections. Black rectangles mark the beginning of a new section. Almost half of the stories begin with a visualization that, in most cases, is an overview visualization. Comparison and detailed visualizations usually appear after the overview visualization in the later section of stories. Schneiderman's visual information seeking mantra, overview first, seems to apply here as well. The data-driven text, that is green rectangles, tend to appear closer to their related visualizations. Although this fact is hard to confirm from this figure, as it does not take into account the layout of stories, which greatly affect the positioning of the text. We observe that majority of visualizations in our sample collection add textual elements in them. Examples of these are captions, titles, annotations, and tooltips. It was interesting to note that less well-known visualizations tended to have longer captions and more textual annotations. This distribution plot, for instance, has a title, subtitle, and a textual annotation that describes the main takeaway from this visual. In some cases, textual annotations inside a visualization may explain every part of the visualization. Textual elements inside a visualization not only makes it a self-sufficient unit of information but also serve as anchor points that are picked up in the text and makes it easier for the reader to quickly go to the relevant part of the visualization while reading the story. The visualizations are placed close to the text that describes them. This way, they can be easily referenced and do not require any numbering. In some cases, visualizations are introduced before their interpretation. This usually includes the explanation of visual encoding or specific aspects of visual design that may have influenced the data representation. Finally, the use of consistent colors to format phrases and the textual narrative according to the visualization is another type of linking we observed in some stories. This type of linking can enable quick reading as users can quickly and easily find connections of various parts of visualization in the textual narrative. Grounded in the analysis, we came up with 9 different guidelines, or we call them best practices, that we believe can be helpful for the designers of similar stories. While the complete list can be found in the paper, I will describe a few of them here. The first is to provide sufficient background information. Since the target audience is broad and diverse for such stories, it is important to include domain-specific terminology in the story so that the readers can easily follow. Second is the use of vernacular or everyday language to describe domain-specific terms or geographical entities. It is also important to describe what is visualized and how it is visualized. For instance, explaining non-intuitive visual encodings, especially if the visualization might not be familiar for every reader. The visualization placed next to the text helps the reader better understand the description. It avoids unnecessary scrolling or other similar interactions for connecting the visual with text. Finally, the addition of textual elements can make the visualization self-explanatory, intuitive, and can hint at specific insights. Expressive annotations even make it possible to use non-standard and less well-known visualization in a story. With our analysis, we took a slightly different perspective and tried to understand the role of textual narrative in more depth. We hope that the identified best practices will help authors of data stories. We also hope that they can be valuable in informing the design of visual data reporting solutions or story authoring tools. We believe that the identified qualitative codes are a valuable contribution and can be easily extended to other types of stories. That concludes my talk. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer your questions.